and I'm a teacher here at Dawson College on unceded Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. I teach in sociology and humanities. I'm excited to welcome back Dan Hickey for our second webinar. So I would want you to join me in welcoming him. Dan is a professor at Indiana University Bloomington in the Learning Sciences program. He has a PhD in psychology from Vanderbilt University and a postdoctoral fellowship from ETS Center for Performance Assessment. In his academic career, it spans over 3 decades, starting in the 90s. Since then, Dan has produced an impressive body of work with over 150 scholarly articles, including co-authoring with notables such as Jim Pellegrino, Susan Goldman, and John Bransford, as well as some of our Quebec scholars, Thérèse Laferrière and Alain Breleux. He has over 6,000 citations to this work. His research focus on educational assessment, on participatory learning and design of innovative learning environments. He has worked on leading curricular innovations such as NASA's Exploring the Environment, MIT's Project New Media Literacy, and Indiana University's Quest Atlantis, just to name a few. His experience with online teaching started in 2009, so definitely a head start on a lot of us who were thrown into it. He's been deeply involved in research of open badges and other forms of web-enabled credentials. His research has been supported by the MacArthur Foundation, the Natural Science Foundation, in the US, and Google and the US Department of Education and others. His current research is supported by an NSF grant and combines a socio-constructivist innovation called playable case studies with the instruction and assessment strategies from his online instruction. So once again, Dan, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We're looking forward to the conversation today, and this is the second part in a 2-part webinar series on the challenge of assessment. I'm going to hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Salma Hamdani, who's going to kind of set the tone for today's workshop.
Thank you, my wonderful colleague, Corey. And hi, everyone, welcome. So as Corey said, during the first part of this exchange was the first webinar where we looked at some of the challenges in assessments, and particularly with online platforms, so reimagining online assessments. This one has a different flavor. So this webinar will be looking at culturally sustaining classroom assessments. So some of our assessments or the way that we approach this assessment is maybe seemingly neutral, but may have some inherent biases and that we are not necessarily sensitive to, but that could be messages that we're sending our students, or that could be received differently depending on who our audience is. So it'll be really interesting to explore this topic, and remember that this is a conversation, so we welcome everybody's comments and input. And hopefully we'll walk away with some good ideas and some good thoughts and some more conversations from this. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And now I pass the baton on to Dan.
Okay. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Selma. Thank you all for coming. I'm super excited to be here again. It's great to see such a diverse group of people from so many different campuses, and I just am so impressed by the group you've brought together. And I'm particularly with the conversation that we've had in the last several weeks of really exploring how we can transform our assessment practices. We've had some great examples. I've added Selma's. She's a participant in this presentation, and she's got some good ones. I'm here, though, with Morgan Wow. She is a first-year PhD student in the Learning Sciences program. And as I'll show you, she's really helped bring to life some of these ideas that we have. I'm also here with Chris Anderson and Grant Chartrand, also active members of my lab who are actively participating in these ongoing efforts. I'm going to go ahead and screen share. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about transfer of learning, but what I really want to talk about, we talked about that several weeks ago, but what I really want to talk about is what I'm now calling culturally sustaining classroom assessment. This is very early on. I'm still not settled that that's the right acronym, because I do care also about external testing. I'm variously calling it culturally sustaining educational assessment. What I want to make sure is that people don't think I'm talking about an assessment of something being culturally sustaining, but rather that I'm talking about classroom assessment, formative and summative assessment, and achievement educational testing that sustains diversities of cultures. So my work in this regard is really shaped by a number of blessings that I've had throughout my career. And one was that I had a postdoc at Educational Testing Service in the mid-90s at the Center for Performance Assessment. This was a center that was set up to support this explosion of innovation that erupted in the early 90s and promptly collapsed literally before I even got to ETS. And that I talked about that a little bit last week. It left a big impression on me. But I also had the pleasure of working some with Laurie Shepard, and I read this piece that she published in Educational Research Review in 1993 about test validity. And I had already known about that item up there on the left. That is an actual item. That was an operational item in the SAT for several years. And Asa Hilliard, who I also had the pleasure of working at Georgia State, had already flagged, given incontrovertible evidence that that item was biased against people who didn't grow up around oarsmans and regattas. That's the correct answer. But what Laurie talked about in this chapter was kindergarten readiness tests. They're very Piagetian readiness tests that became widely used for a period of time in the late 60s. And they had a very pernicious effect of holding kids back 1 and even 2 years from kindergarten because ostensibly they weren't ready for kindergarten. Well, that test had items like whether or not the children knew whether a teacup was associated with a saucer. Well, most of the kids who were not kindergarten ready and who ended up entering kindergarten 2 years later were of color. And a decade later, you had this terrible phenomenon of a bunch of freshmen and sophomores who were 18 years old and who were emancipated and dropped out of school. So that really left just an enormous impression on me throughout my career. And I'm really happy now to have been getting some really good support and really been making some progress in moving forward with this thing I talked about at our last meeting, which is this multi-level assessment model. I know that some of you were not here at the last meeting, so I'll just very briefly talk about it. This model, it's really about aligning learning across 3 or 4 levels of increasingly formal assessments, ranging from these very immediate formative assessment of student discourse, weekly summative assessments in the form of reflections, more formal summative assessments of understanding, and then those bracketing those, so to speak, with summative assessments of achievement that I characterize as being discrete. In other words, they play a minor role. They really tell me whether or not I'm working. But theoretically speaking, let's see, I believe that's right. This is cutting that off. Yes. The main point is appreciating that at these levels that the orientation of the assessment changes, which means that when you teach to the test at one level, it's not compromised at the next level, and that the formality changes, and that the time scale of learning that's being assessed at each of those levels changes. That's this broader multi-level assessment model that I have been really aggressively refining in my online courses, my courses, and of collaborators. And so what I want to talk about today is efforts that we've made to revise this framework to make it more culturally sustaining. Much of this work was done in one of the toughest pieces of writing I've done really in probably a decade, and this was a chapter for the Handbook of Educational Psychology. I took a chapter that I wrote with Jim Pellegrino in 2005 on transfer, and I've extended it. What's driving this work is the assumption that your assumptions about transfer have profound influences on education, via formative and summative assessments and external tests. This chapter is shaped by the broad consensus that deficit-based responses to historical and continuing inequities are wrong, and that what we need to support are the range of asset-based responses, funds of knowledge, funds of identity. I've had the pleasure over the last several years of working with Rebekah Neary, who joined the Learning Sciences program at IU. And this was a very influential article on culturally relevant education, and she characterized it as a multi-level problem, that the teacher's resistance to asset-based response. And by levels here, and we have a symposium pending at KERA currently, you can really think of levels in terms of pedagogy, where most people think of culturally relevant pedagogy. But you can also think about the relationship, as I'll talk about today, of classroom assessment. But as Rebekah studies in her work, you can think about that in terms of school data use, right? Everybody's talking about social emotional learning, and well, schools are awash in data about SEL, but what a lot of people don't realize, especially if you start asking disadvantaged kids in particular about SEL, they're going to start talking about trauma, and you're going to be facing potential disclosures. And teachers just aren't ready for that. And so they're very resistant of getting into that space because they don't want to be confronted with having, for instance, to do disclosure. That's a very serious problem. But there's also the level of external achievement tests. And so Jennifer Randall really convinced me, really pulled me around. In the past, I've been fairly agnostic about external tests, that it's too political, you can't change them. And she's convinced me that what we do in a lot of bias review panels is essentially eliminate race and culture. And when you eliminate race and culture, what's left is whiteness. And so we'll return to that today. So at the core of my work is the work of the late Randy Ingle. You may be familiar with the term productive disciplinary engagement. Those are 4 design principles that are among the most useful and used educational design principles to emerge from situated theories of learning. First and foremost, that you want to problemize content from each learner's own perspective. Then you want to give authority to students to solve the problems that result, and in doing so, hold them accountable to disciplinary discourse and provide the resources they need. Expansive framing, which is one of the last things she published before her untimely death, is a further extension where you really push students to make connections beyond the course and position them as accountable authors. And the 2012 Educational Psychologist piece has 5 really compelling explanations of why framing instruction expansively from the perspective of each student is likely to increase the extent to which school learning is useful and used in subsequent settings, which I think everyone is in agreement is the ultimate goal of education. Really influential for me was Priyanka Agrawal's critique of PDE with Tesha Sengupta Irvine, her doctoral advisor. First off, and importantly, they acknowledge that PDE, if you ask students to problematize from their own perspective, that's naturally more inclusive than more expository pedagogy that doesn't do that. But they point out that the evidence is overwhelming that minoritized students are still positioned out of classroom discourse because of the overwhelming social authority often overwhelms intellectual authority, and for other reasons. And for that reason, they introduced in this article, In Cognition and Instruction, one of the absolutely top journals in our field, this connected and productive disciplinary engagement principles. First and foremost, using socio-political controversies to problematize disciplinary knowledge. In other words, when you empower students to problematize from their own perspective, you want to encourage them where they feel it's appropriate to use socio-political controversies, use race, use class, use power to help problematize course content. You want to curb undue social authority, ensure equitable accountability, and treat socio-political controversies as resources. So what took me about 6 months to do was to extend all 5 of Randy's explanations of expansive framing using the CPDE principles. And that really laid what I believe is a pretty solid theoretical underpinning of what I'm going to talk about today. I did not in the end include the CSCA principles in the chapter. It was really, the chapter was too long. The ideas were too tentative and too self-referential. I didn't have enough examples to draw from. So what I'll be talking about today has not been published anywhere. One version of it was presented at the American Psychological Association, but it's advanced quite a bit just in the last 2 weeks. So I'm really excited to share some of this. This is what I'm currently calling the CSCA design principles. So I'm extending Priyanka's ideas of socio-political controversies to do that both in instruction and in assessment. Support broad transfer in of diverse forms of knowledge and identity via informal assessment of classroom discourse. So teachers do a lot of very informal assessment in online courses. Some online courses, there isn't very much classroom discourse. Even if it's in a discussion form, you can do this. In my courses, there's an extensive interaction directly on comments on student work, as I'll show you, and that's an opportunity to support this transfer in. You're going to create opportunities for marginalized students to have authority in your formal and informal feedback around assessment. And then finally, you want to ensure equitable accountability by holding all students accountable for diverse ways of knowing. I'm going to stop before I dive into my example and see whether Corey, Selma, do you want to add, or Morgan, if anybody wants to add anything here, or if there are any questions. Any questions in the chat? I do want to point out that as a situative theorist, the boundaries between assessment and instruction are much more fluid for me than they are for many assessment scholars who tend to be more oriented theoretically to constructivism. The measurement community tends to be more associationist. Both of those communities make much sharper distinctions. And a situative perspective does that because one takes a much broader view of learning. Transformation of classroom discourse in situ is a form of learning. Proof scores on an achievement test is another form of learning. It's a kind of a peculiar form of learning, if not bizarre, but those are both kinds of learning that serve very different purposes. How do you create opportunities for authority? Okay, yes, I will get to that. Thank you, Ariel. Okay.
I could just jump in and just say that already the idea of introducing or bringing in sociopolitical controversies, I think it's really important to, I think it's interesting to not think of it as something that's happening out there, but even to kind of pose the classroom itself as a socio-political controversy. So in some contexts, early on in the semester, or if we've done some groundwork to establish discussions, is putting up an image of an unequal playing field. And I think asking students to kind of reflect kind of on their own, so they're not putting themselves in a position to be targeted, but to kind of be able to reflect on how the classroom we're in itself is an unequal playing field. And then as a kind of data collection and bringing that back to the whole group with all the students' ideas and having a chance to discuss and look at, you know, what students themselves as authorities are able to kind of say is happening even in the classroom right now. And I think that's a kind of early way on that. I think we can kind of bring that into the classroom.
Yeah, in fact, I'll be interested to get your feedback. I just modified my syllabus in response to our conversations over the last week. So I'm going to use some examples first from this P507. This is this assessment and learning course that has really been because I teach it every year. I teach it in the summer. I really have been very aggressively refining it every semester. However, one of the things I'm going to admit is that I travel a lot. I teach this course in the summer, and I'm often traveling quite a bit. And so, but a big part of my online pedagogy is making sustainable demands on instructors. A lot of people, well-intentioned instructors, will get very ambitious in their online courses and end up creating massive amounts of private interaction where they're interacting, looking at student work, grading it, providing formative feedback that may or may not be used. So my model really tries to eliminate as much as possible. Maybe 5% of my time in a given semester is spent interacting in private with students. And usually it's just something I'm putting a comment in the grade book that says, see my comments on your work that are in public that everyone can see. So I'm currently in the process of revising this course using the principles I'm going to talk about today. And some of the examples that I'll show you come from this course. So I have already extended my course objectives. I've added this. I've done a few things in the past, but I didn't have this. I didn't actually have that fourth objective as an objective in the syllabus. So I've actually added it, saying, you know, and so I've struggled a bit with this wording here. I'd said, you know, initially I said you will learn how practices, principles, and policies should be extended. I changed it to can, and I recognize that my choice of wording here and my authority and my power as an instructor, whether I'm requiring students to do this or not. So that's all very much open to discussion and interpretation at this point. One of the things that we've discussed, and Corey really had some great insights about this, that reflected frankly, a pretty big mistake I made that I'll come back to. But one of the things I did in my cultural reflections was it was worded in a way that required students, that students were assigned to speak for whatever group they identified with. And the backlash against that was quite fierce. And I'm a little embarrassed that I didn't realize how problematic that was. I will say that doing so led to a massive increase in the use of sociopolitical controversies. And I'm studying those changes from semester to semester. But right now, not only do I want to make it clear to students, you will never be required to speak for or represent any identity or perspective, and you should never require your classmates to do so. Selma has a great example of this that we'll be returning to. So here's this existing short assignment of rare students. It's a fairly routine thing. The textbook has some really great guidelines on creating different assessment item formats. And so here's Morgan's response, part of Morgan's response to that. She's, because of her background in teaching English as a foreign language, she created this item. I think you'll be able to hear the water or soda. So she's found a nice clip, and you just drag the arrows in there. So she's teaching intonation. So that's that's a very nice example. Water or soda. Central to this model of pedagogy is this engagement routine. That's a very simple one that draws directly from Randy's theories of expansive framing. The students are literally just instructed to summarize the guidelines from the textbook in order of relevance and to provide a rationale at minimum for why number one is the most relevant and and the last one is the least relevant. And this is a really simple way to get students to engage with course content and with each other, because they can look at each other's decisions and share them. So this is the kind of shared engagement that we've gotten very good at fostering in this class. So the first principle, use sociopolitical controversy to problematize content and instruction and assessments. And so these more general principles here are ones that I've taken away. These are paraphrasing from Priyanka Agrawal's chapter. And this is what, after some thought, after some work, this is what that assignment, how I modified that assignment. Create a short answer item for minoritized learners. First, describe a real or imagined, right? And then I've reframed those guidelines a little bit there. And then I've used the same routine, indicate which guideline was most helpful for you and why. So Morgan, I'd like you to come on and say a little bit about it, what it was like to write this item, and say a little bit more about that guideline that you chose.
Yeah, so I will write this item for a specific minoritized learner, which is ethnic Miao, which is one of the 56 ethnic in China. So I will write this item using their native language. So as you can see, the item that I rewrote was, in my opinion, the zi, which is the horse in ethnic Miao, is better livestock than Dima, which is the cow in ethnic Miao. So I changed those vocabulary in their native language so they can feel more relevant to their cultural background. And the guideline that I've chosen was expanded your view of your discipline to avoid writer of cultural uncertainties. I thought this guideline was most helpful for me because as many of you guys know, China is a largely homogeneous society, which 90% of the population were Han Chinese. So it is very likely for a teacher to avoid each students their own cultural background, as most of the students were Han ethnics. So it is very important for a teacher to keep in mind of each student's different backgrounds and value their native language, right?
And I apologize, it's a bit of a meta issue here that we're using assessment to talk about assessment. Let me show you a somewhat different one. So this is the assignment on validity, right? So summarize and rank the sources of validity evidence, same routine, different ideas, but a similar routine. Notice though, that they're not writing about validity in the abstract. They're actually being asked to not only summarize the guidelines, the relevance of the different sources of validity evidence in their context, they're actually asked to go through and identify the most relevant sources of validity evidence for each of the items that they developed in the first part of the course. And so this is this key to expansive framing, that everything is just insistently situated in stuff that people bring to the course rather than framed expert framing that you often see in problem-based learning approaches, for example. So I've extended this assignment, a similar set of guidelines. Revisit the validity evidence for diverse learners. Describe one or more real, then revisit your responses to the previous two items. And so, so here's Morgan's response to this item. She's elaborated, as you can see. She's demonstrating a bunch of expertise that nobody else in this class has. So my job as an instructor, and she has that expertise by virtue of her status of being the only person in this class who was born and raised through high school years in China, and who has experience teaching English to Chinese nationals as part of her work. So, so Morgan, I want you to say a little bit about this one. I think it's really interesting. Notice that she did not change her rankings, but she qualified them. And what's really important, the point I really want people to take away here is she didn't change the ranking, but she qualified them. In order to make the decision not to change the ranking, but she had to revisit those guidelines and think about them in a somewhat different context, right? So she re-engaged with the core content. We're not tacking on the culturally sustaining part. We're using the culturally sustaining extension to further engage her with the core competencies in the course. So Morgan, you want to say a little bit about what the example here? And what that thought process was like about digging back into it?
Yeah, sure. So when I revisited the validity evidence for diverse learners, as I mentioned, I really didn't change much of my ranking, as I thought my original ranking is still very important. However, I did pay more attention to like specific evidence this time. So for example, I decided I would pay more attention to relation to other variables because it's really important to see how students will be predicted to perform outside of the classroom. So I specifically mentioned how students' performance can influence their test scores, like standardized test scores, and how the standardized test scores can influence students pretty much their whole future. I specifically mentioned the importance of this evidence and how by incorporate more culturally relevant examples or items in assignments will help those students in their future studies. Right.
Thanks. So if you take away anything, now one of the things that's been really interesting in this course is almost every semester I have one very politically conservative student, often very vocally so. Well, in 2018, part of my motivation for the changes is I had one student in the anonymous course survey say that they felt silenced by the instructors in the textbook political correctness. So you know, I want to drive home the point here that this is not political correctness. This is a strategy that is proving quite helpful for getting learners to dig even more deeply into the core course content, whether or not they think it's, you know, and I'm pretty confident next summer I'll once again have a student who pushes back on some of this stuff. And it's been a very interesting process of kind of winning them over and convincing them that, no, you need to do this so you learn this content. And no, you know, getting rid of assessment bias is not political correctness. If you're an expert in assessment, you need to know about differential item functioning. You need to know the way that measurement people remove, you know, what a bias panel looks like. So moving on to the second one, support broad transfer in of diverse funds of knowledge. So central to situative models of transfer is paying particular attention to the knowledge that students transfer in to the original learning situation, right? So just to drive home the point, Randy Engle's work, this is also another theory, act-oriented transfer, Joanne Lobato, they all really attend to what people bring to the learning situation and how that impacts whether or not what they learn transfers. And so I hope some of you are familiar with funds of knowledge and funds of identity. This is probably the most widely used asset-based approach at least in the US and K-12 settings. And there's a nice piece from Moulton that talks about the different kinds of identities that students bring. So this has been part of my class now. These reflections have been a central part of my course really since the very beginning. They draw very directly from Melissa Grisolfi's notions of consequential engagement. That very first one, you know, how did your, in this case, how did your instructional goal lend itself to this activity? The math teacher who says, wow, I really couldn't apply portfolio assessment in my math class for these reasons. That person has learned a lot about portfolio assessment. That's what we mean by this contextual engagement. And collaborative engagement, who did you interact with? Now, to talk about the broader, this is a close level reflection. I'm missing a second quote there, sorry. These are a summative assessment of their prior engagement. And I use these reflections to award them points for completing their assignment. I never ever grade the content of their assignment. If they complete the required elements of the assignment and they post a coherent reflection, they get all their points, right? And that's how I drive my grading time down very low. But the students know that I'm reading these reflections. Most of my comments, the private comments I give, right, their reflections are posted in public, but my feedback when I award points are private in the gradebook. So I will read these reflections and I will comment on them so the students know that I'm reading them. They take them seriously. So but there's a notion of prolepsis that's central to sociocultural and cultural theories of learning, drawing directly from Michael Cole. And that is the way that the future shapes the present. The fact that the students know that they're going to have to reflect in this manner after each assignment draws their attention to engaging in that way from the beginning. So the cultural engagement is really important, right? So knowledge and therefore learning are inherently cultural and social. How did social and cultural factors impact the way you engage in this assignment? How might what you learned this week contribute to making education more inclusive?
Dan,
So,
I don't know if we could just pause here. There are some questions. If you could elaborate, not many of us here are familiar with the term funds of knowledge.
okay.
And then, yeah, there's one more comment question, but maybe
Sure.
that might come up later.
Yeah, let me go back to that slide. We've got plenty of time. So FOK, Funds of Knowledge from Louise Moll, originated in the borderlands in Arizona. He was a professor at Arizona State. And when they went into schools, they learned, they were in predominantly Hispanic schools, many students with more than half of the kids speaking English as a second language, and many of them still English language learners. And many of their teachers were Hispanic. They were not drawing at all on Hispanic culture. All of their examples, all of the framing of instruction that teachers were doing, most of it was very much based on white middle class experiences. And so Funds of Knowledge was about getting teachers to go and actually do home visits and get to know, they call them ethnographies, where teachers would go and visit these families and learn about their values, their experiences, and become more familiar with what was happening in these children's homes so that they could draw and help those students draw on that knowledge to frame their classroom learning. Funds of Identity from Moises Esteban Guitart, a Spaniard, takes Funds of Knowledge and gets it more into a digital age and acknowledges that much of the identities that students bring to school are shaped by social media. It eliminates these sort of laborious home visits, and it's much more suited to the sort of current networked realities of both lived experience in schools of young people. So again, these are asset-based approaches that very deliberately use the diversities of ways of knowing, linguistic and cultural diversity that students bring to help frame their classroom instruction, with the expectation, and which is certainly rooted in situative theory, that doing so, when you help students find connections with classroom concepts, with stuff that is important to them, right? We know that prior knowledge matters. And Funds of Knowledge and Funds of Identity say, let's stop extinguishing the prior knowledge that our more diverse learners bring to school. Thanks, Corey. I'm looking at the Oarsman regard our other examples that could be used to those who don't see the problem in a similarly disadvantaged position. Do you want to elaborate on that question?
My apologies. This is my first experience with some of the terminology here, so I'm not sure how else to ask the question, but you mentioned how you had a student who couldn't see what the problem was, was very opinionated about it and conflated it with political correctness. And so I'm wondering if there are similar ways of wording questions using things that would leave them in a similar position of not having the correct reference to make progress.
Yeah, let's come back to that one. That's a great question. That is the challenge that we face, and that's really and we're just running headlong into that one, and acknowledging that. But I do think, in my own experience, putting that Oarsman Regatta problem in front of people and saying that, this was an operational item, it's not hard. You have to be pretty much like, even the American Enterprise Institute, the guys who did the bell curve, they have an article about that particular SAT item where they kind of go off the deep end about it. But what they do is say that that problem has been solved already by differential item functioning, right? That's a psychometric technique where you go in and see, do particular subgroups of students do less well on a given item than they should, given their overall score. So DIF has indeed removed those blatantly biased items, but whether or not the remaining items, the race neutral items that are left, are actually still biased towards whiteness is the open question that we're discussing here. Anyway, so here you see there's Morgan's reflection of validity assignment, and you can see that she's revisiting this. Now, again, I want to reiterate, this is summative assessment of their prior engagement, and therefore I use it to assign points. 70% of their points in this particular class are based on me making sure that they've done this reflection and they complete the required parts of the assignment. 70%, only 30% based on the exams. But they formatively shape engagement. They formatively assess understanding, and that you can look and see there that Morgan really is revisiting the different concepts in the assignment, but it's also shaping their future engagement, because they know that after they complete this first assignment, this first reflection, they know that they're going to be reflecting on it, so that shapes their engagement in that way. And again, this is when I say a situative model of assessment, this is what I'm talking about. This much broader view of learning that treats changing the way you engage in a future assignment is also a form of learning that can be shaped in formative and productive ways by assessment. So then create opportunities for marginalized students to have authority. So central to this, my model of pedagogy, is that there's extensive interaction between peers and instructors in threaded comments that appear directly on student work. And so here's a question that Morgan raised. Again, talking about something that she is able to talk about in a way that really nobody else in the class has access to her expertise. And so my job as an instructor is to further position her as the local expert. So I point out, like, oh, that's interesting. I kind of, because of the Uyghur minority in China, I thought that diversity was a big issue, but now I'm realizing that the government is really trying to suppress diversity and make people assimilate. That's like what happened to Native Americans. And I make a little suggestion here, and I close with, what do you think? I'm not the authority here. My job as the instructor is to not be the authority on things I'm not an authority on, but rather to identify the things that all students, but in particular minoritized students, have the authority and elevate their status wherever I can. And you can see there that she's gone in and further elaborated on it. And so again, I spend, probably 85% of my time in class interacting in this fashion. And what I'm trying to do is make sure that not only do they surface, and Corey pointed out something very interesting in our previous exchange, that I made a comment on Morgan's post that came from my thoughts about what she was doing. And Corey called me out on it, and he was absolutely right that I should not have done that. That was not appropriate. What I need to do is create a space where these things surface and then further help elevate them and help position and where possible reposition, and make sure that my social authority as the instructor in no way closes down these conversations or undermines the authority of the students. Then finally, this is probably the toughest one for us. And look at, Selma has some great examples. So ensure equitable accountability, hold all students accountable for diverse ways of knowing. So return to this. So this is Jennifer Randall's example that is just recently published in Educational Measurement Issues in Practice, a very, very widely read article. It goes to every member of the National Council of Measurement Education. So her argument is that race-neutral assessments, right? So you run items on a standardized test through a bias panel and use differential item functioning, and what you're left with is whiteness. And so she's taken this item, an existing item, and she's modified it to make it anti-racist. So my working hypothesis is that by putting anti-racist assessments alongside ostensibly unbiased assessments should go a long ways towards helping people appreciate that race neutral, like she said in the title of our article, she says there is no such thing as colorblind assessments. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Selma to talk about this great conversation. Well, let me stop and see if there are any questions for what I presented so far. It's 3:17. We've got quite a bit of time left. I'm looking over the
I don't know if I have a question, but I just wanted to kind of put something on the table that, you know, trying to flag discomfort. And one thing that makes me uncomfortable, and I know it's, I like that it's on the slide because I think it reveals something that we are doing, but to see it on a slide, so this idea of imagining the minoritized learner and having to really think about who we are as teachers as we're trying to imagine our learners, and who we're imagining, how we're imagining, why we're imagining. And I think that is something that we do. So I think it's not about taking something like that off a slide, but it's, I think, to acknowledge and sit with that as an uncomfortable practice that is part of our teaching, and it's important to think about here.
Yeah, and I'm learning to be comfortable with the discomfort because I have to be. I mean, I think this work is too important to shy away from it. But my colleague Sylvia Martinez last week did a symposium for us at IU, where she reminded us that very few Hispanics use the term Latinx, and then it makes some of them uncomfortable. And it's almost a trigger for them because it's been well documented that the term Latinx emerged in liberal academia circles and has permeated the print media, for example, and a lot of Hispanics going, hey, wait a minute, wait, that's my language. Who are you to say that I'm to require of me to change the way that I talk because of your sensitivities? So yeah, like the term minoritized, that has gone back and forth whether or not that is the appropriate term. I'm honestly not sure at this point. That's one of the reasons I'm here is to make those decisions. So, Corey, tell us about your class. Or I'm sorry, Selma, tell us about your class.
So thank you so much, Dan, for all that you have presented. I think you've given us quite a lot to think about, and I have to say that I'm very honored and humbled to be part of this conversation. I'm in no way an expert on culturally sustaining classroom assessments. I stumbled on this serendipitously, that's a word. And as we were preparing this webinar, I was asked to pull out some of the examples that could be pertaining to this topic. And just a few weeks ago, I had a perfect example that fit with all that we've been discussing. Again, serendipity. So I teach psychology at Dawson. I'm not sure if I mentioned that, but here it is. And this semester I'm teaching general psychology, a very introductory course. I have students from high school that are making their first steps in the CEGEP system. And we're lucky here at Dawson and in the Montreal area that we have a very diverse classrooms. We have beautiful heterogeneity and students from all over the world. And one of the theme of my class is race, ethnicity, and migration, just to explore concepts of psychology, anthropology, and history, because my course is linked with those other disciplines and looking at those themes. And I give students an imaginary lab. So they have to create, they're given a very broad context that's related to the theme of the class, and they have to create an experiment based on that. So do something where they explore psychological phenomena. So in our lab one procedure, basically the students are given the context, they must answer a series of questions, and then they share this in a gallery walk with the rest of the class. One of my themes was dealing with the migrant the migrant story. So I pulled out some information from the website, the UN website, where it had numbers associated with the Syrian migration from 2019. I think that's in the next slide. Yeah. So this was the very, very broad topic that the students were given. So that's the context, just numbers thrown around, complex adjustment to the migrants, and then I'm asking the students to devise an experiment in this context, and I'm hoping that they'll go along, like they'll go explore the developmental challenges that children can have and children of migrants can have, etc. So in the next slide, you'll see the what happened in my class. So it's you can put up both situations. So so my students are working in teams in small groups, and I'm walking around checking on what they're doing and providing help when needed. And in one of the groups, the conversation was very interesting because one of the students came forward as a refugee herself, a Syrian refugee, and who moved here about 4 years ago with her family, and she was graciously sharing her story. It could have been a very traumatizing situation. It could have been a situation where the students turn around and say, "Hey, you're of Syrian origin. What do you know about this?" But it wasn't the case. The climate of the class was so welcoming that she shared her story willingly and in a very informative way. And she placed herself as the expert on the topic, because clearly none of us in the class were. Or at least not that I know of. I certainly was not the expert on that situation. And it was I use the word, it was a beautifully organic moment, but I think you'll see what I mean. So the group was having a conversation, and then the following table, the table right next to them kind of joined in. Then the other table to the left joined in, and slowly it became a whole class conversation. So little by little, that conversation was so interesting and so genuine that it pulled in everybody from the class, and we had a very enriching discussion. And you can see in the next slide verbatim the report of, well, a section of the report of the students. And what it really reminded me was that I threw numbers at the students saying, "Hey, this is how many people are being displaced," but I like that they brought it back to the human aspect. So in the first line, you see that they recognize that one of their team members has gone through a similar situation. And somewhere in this long text, it says that that people have their own stories, that in their own individuals with unique experiences, and that shape who they are. So inadvertently, this was a culturally sustaining assignment or assessment, and as I said, the climate of the class was made so that it didn't put the onus on the student. The student came forward. The student felt comfortable enough to share this. I see some stuff in chat. I can share the other examples, or
Let me go to the next slide.
Yes. So this got me thinking about some of the examples that I use in my class. So concretely, in practical terms, what am I doing? So yes, there's a lot of text there, but in the neutral example, this is a question from a quiz where I'm given the situation of, it's an interaction communication course, a separate one, but it's an example of a person named Trixie, clearly female, heterosexual, getting a situation of catfishing, but that's a neutral example. And then in hindsight, this felt biased because I'm only presenting one perspective of what a person can be, a cisgender heteronormative person. So this was I created this a few years ago, so I created another example where I'm representing a similar situation or in the same context, but just changing from Trixie, a female, a female going through that situation. I just put in instead Walker, who is a person that, and without giving it, associating a gender to that person. And from the feedback of the students, some of the students appreciated that because they're like, oh, that's like me. So representation matters, and it could be as minor as just changing something in your exam question or how it's phrased, and providing that that diverse representation, and walking away from the biases, because as I think, I can't remember who said this, but the biases are, there's the biases themselves, and then the implications of what message we're sending the students and what message they're incorporating. And then I have another example of this one about an Indigenous person, and this one was really beautiful because I don't think I told Dan or Liz about this, but this example is based on one of my students, who I asked her if it's okay if I used her story as an example, changing her name, of course. And so I wrote it and sent it to her just to check if I wasn't making any faux pas. I'm no expert in this. So, and my superpower is to fumble and stumble. So I didn't want to fumble and stumble in a wrong way to hurt people. So I shared this with her, and we co-designed this question, and it was used in the following semester for other students. But I thought it was, I didn't feel comfortable enough to create something like this on my own, or because I'm not an expert, but my student who is living this situation could help me through this. So that's pretty much it on my end. See, there's lots of stuff in the chat. And a hand up.
I love that example, Selma. That's all we have to present, and the rest of the time is for discussion. I've got to get the chat back up. I just made it go away. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you.
And pull up the chat.
We also have Corey's hand, which is raised.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I was just waiting to see if anybody else wanted to jump in, but I guess just following up on Selma's example, which is great. There's so many things there about the relationships with the students, and it's not just that final product, what ends up on a paper, but there's like the relationships you're building between students, and I always think we could do these activities, but a lot of the time it's about creating the culture in the classroom. Like, how are we creating a culture in the classroom so that this student felt like they could maybe share a personal story with the other students, right? It's not just a coincidence either. But on the flip side, we're lucky I think it's a huge privilege when a student comes to us and to say something or to share how they're feeling. But we also have a responsibility to assume as well that students are not coming and telling us how they're doing. And so, brought up early on that the word in terms of trauma, and we're talking about trauma responsive education more and more, but like, how do we build in kind of our own checks and balances with ourselves as we're trying to make steps that we're also taking seriously, that these examples, while might be really empowering to one student, might feel quite isolating and alienating to another. And that's something I'm really struggling with, right? And we talked early on about that fear. Dan, you're saying that resistance of like, it feels so loaded to try and take some of these considerations into practice, and some teachers just walk away and are comfortable in this fantasy that we're in a neutral assessment zone. Like, I'm just going to try and keep everything neutral. But the point is, none of it's neutral. So we need to step into discomfort, like you said. But yeah, I'm curious, is how do we also make sure that we're not creating kind of hard experiences for students in these exam questions that are attempting to, you know, invite in all the experiences in the classroom.
Yeah, I was struggling with it today. I started trying to create looking at my formative and summative assessments from each assignment and think, and thinking, like, for example, when I got to the, I have a chapter on an assignment on standardized testing, and I realized that, you know, the book presents this sort of mainstream view that, you know, differential item functioning and bias review panels have solved this problem. And frankly, the author, Popham, he's 90, and in several places, he actually presents what most people would consider a deficit-based view. And so I found some nice other resources on the you know, people who are arguing that the SAT and the GRE are both racially biased, still are racially biased, and that they block access. And then Django Paris, in his piece on culturally sustaining assessment, he says, wait a minute, we're not saying we don't want students of color to have access to majoritized ways of knowing. No, knowing, you know, doing well on standardized tests until those tests change, you know, those are gatekeepers to huge opportunities. So that's one of these ones I'm really struggling with. And at this point, I think it's just a matter of getting the diversity of perspectives up there. I think, Corey, that was your idea about getting students to generate items that privilege their ways of knowing.
Yeah, I was just building off of your example of like identifying the examples that establish, you know, like an advantage disadvantage knowing. And so, like, what would it mean to ask students to in fact do the same thing, create a biased question that actually advantages, you know, what if we use the language of funds of knowledge, like what would it mean to create a question on an exam that purposely is trying to bias funds of knowledge from their experience, and being exposed to those different questions, students can really hopefully maybe start to see the ways that they're kind of I don't know, kind of externalized, or they don't have access to that same kind of fund of knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that would really drive home the point. I think the other thing that I'm thinking hard about is, so for instance, in the assignment on standardized testing, there's some very factual stuff about bias in testing that I can present to my students and hold them accountable for knowing, right? They need to know that before diff was widely used in the 1980s, that assessments were, you know, psychometrically very biased. That's a fact. That's not political. That's a real thing that if you're an expert in assessment, you should know. And I'm realizing as I look at each of my assignments, again, it's a little hard, it's a little meta to be focusing on an assessment course to talk about culturally sustaining assessment. But I think I am identifying topics in each of my assignments, in validity, in reliability, in evaluation of instruction. Right, I ran across a piece that talked about that there's evidence that white principals are biased in the evaluation of teachers of color when they do merit reviews, right? So you can find, I think, for many of the relevant socio-political controversies, as an instructor, we can find, you know, factual, you know, disciplinary knowledge that is pertinent to those discussions and present it. It's like, no, we're not, this is not, again, I've always got these students who are very sensitive to anything, you know, who lecture me in private that, you know, critical race theory is Marxist and you know, but seem to be finding a way to frame it in a way. I'm getting better at presenting in a way that isn't seen as a political agenda. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I was wondering, no, two things. One is I'm wondering about the people in the audience. Like how do they have examples? Do they have examples of places that they feel that their assessments may be biased and they're not sure about and they'd like to talk about them? Or but I also, as I was saying that to myself, I wondered if being sensitive starts making us question how to even engage and position, going back to your point of positioning students in positions of authority, which is very much that notion of the Randy Engel notion of getting students to take up action, to take up agency. But I'm starting to ask myself, like, even asking my colleagues, the people who are participating here, would I be putting them on the spot if I were to say, Chris Whitaker, tell me what you think? Like, how sensitive do we have to be? And is there, like, how do we come to terms with it? I do like a lot of the things that, that I've heard, which are, like Selma's point about co-designing something with students. But I'm thinking about that, that's a lot of work for a teacher to do that kind of work with their students. So how might we get people to, our colleagues sitting around this table, this virtual table, how might we even get each other now? Like, could we do an exercise together to get us to share in a way that doesn't feel threatening? And, and does that start the conversation for us to say, how might we get our students engaged without making them feel threatened?
Yeah, my sense is that if you, right, so there's this fundamental tension across this work around framing. There's broad agreement among cognitive and learning scientists that almost all instruction needs to be framed with examples, illustrations, contexts. And that then begs the question, what is the source of those frames? Randy says that the source of those frames should be the students themselves, and that should happen early on. Well, nonetheless, as an instructor, I can use my expertise to go in, for instance, with the validity assignment. And I feel like I'm making good success. I've got a lot of work to do, but I feel like I'm going in, and for each assignment, I'm able to find at least one socio-political controversy that is based in fact, that where there is factual knowledge, but those facts themselves, such as the bias of the SAT through the 1980s, that raises the socio-political controversy that invites people, especially diverse people, to share their perspectives on those issues in a way that is inviting but not requiring. So to me, that's what I'm really focusing on, is how can I use my expertise as someone who's been teaching for almost 20 years to bring those in, and then still let people problematize that situation from their own perspectives. Yes, I want to ask Chris, Grant, Morgan, you guys have anything to share at this point based on our shared experiences? Speaking of putting people on the spot. Chris, I wonder if any of this came up in your dissertation studies of social annotation with English faculty.
The idea of framing in particular, these
framing, or really just equity and justice in the context of that grand experiment that you're studying?
Not specifically that I can think of right now. But I know in my own teaching, when I was teaching the educational psychology course, that these kinds of framings and these experiences for students were really helpful in, especially when we got to the equity and learning unit, that as they tried to draw on their own experiences to think about what what equity means, and again, as they frame it from their own perspective, I think it's really helpful for them to connect to not only their own experiences, but they're seeing other people's experiences, others of their peers' experiences, and able to kind of connect with those and broaden their own perspectives. Which when we focus so much just on the disciplinary content, we tend to lose some of that, like the humanity of the individual students. And so when they have opportunities to connect to their own experiences and frame it from their own perspectives, and then be able to be exposed to others' experiences as well, then I think that helps bring that humanity back into the course a little bit, so that we're not so focused just on content, but that these are people involved in this whole learning situation.
Okay. Yeah, Elizabeth, Chris, you got a hand up, and some have hands up. So
Go ahead, Chris.
Selma and I share the same brain anyway, so whether one of us talks or the other one talks, I'm not sure it's all that different. I was thinking about what kind of lessons we might learn from the field of universal design for learning in this, because designing it, I think anytime you design something, it's going to have a bias in it. But if you instead of designing and providing an assessment for students or for a group, if instead you nurture a culture of conversations where students can have and bring in multiple perspectives in conversations. I teach physics, so I will quite often purposefully try to get groups of students approaching the same problem from two different angles, so that we can have a conversation about why they approach something from a different angle. And while I am designing the questions, the idea there is trying to leverage the power of conversations and trying to nurture some diversity within those conversations, and then using that to highlight the benefits of diverse conversations. And I'm just thinking about the kinds of activities we do in our classrooms, where students are doing the work during class, where they're engaged in conversations with each other, constructing artifacts. I mean, I wonder if that's not a way of almost UDLing this thing, right? So that you're nurturing the conversations and creating a safe space. Although I don't know who put in the chat, but the idea of brave spaces as opposed to safe spaces, that's a nice angle on that. So how could we learn from universal design for learning in creating the conditions by which diverse perspectives can come out, a little bit like what happened in Selma's room, right? And that conversation didn't just happen out of nowhere. That happened out of a culture that within the classroom that valued conversations and listening rather than telling. So it was kind of a question and a comment.
yeah, I'll chime in before we go to Selma, and that is that I saw something very interesting. We're doing a comprehensive review of all of the work on PDE and expansive framing, and I ran across an article by Rebekah Neary about infographics with Joe Pullman that's forthcoming. And one of the students did her science poster on hair straightener, the chemistry of hair straightener. but that student chose to do that, which is very interesting to me because many of us have pointed to this example that somebody had this brilliant idea of let's teach chemistry to Black girls by teaching them about hair straightener in ways that were just blatantly insulting. It's a very different thing to allow somebody to choose to do that than to say, here, we've designed a whole lesson for you and just you in chemistry on hair straightening because I know you care about that. So that really drove home the very different way of going about it. Selma?
Yeah, Chris and I really do share the same brain because I was going to go in the same direction of how do we create those brave spaces. And like I said, I think I stumbled on this, obviously using some elements of active learning in my classroom really fostered that openness and agency in the students to have a voice and to be able to share in safely and bravely in the classroom. I've been using, I ramped up my active learning ratio in the semester. So that's another thing that probably helped create that climate in the class. But somebody, I can't remember who once said that we're not teaching content, we're teaching students. And that really just drove home to me that, you know, to focus on the humans that are sitting in those seats and including them in the content, in the conversation. And it's as you said, Dan, it's a culture of including instead of telling. And some of that, the inclusion involves the student returning being involved in the creation of these of the content and of the spaces. And I think I said this before, representation matters. And when the students see themselves in what we do, in just a simple question, exam question, for example, they could say, oh, this is something that hits home. This is like me. So that's that's bringing in an affective layer to that content that will further drive the message home. Those are just, I guess that's all I had to say.
I wonder what Michael Dugdale thinks. You had so many great questions last week. I'm curious what he's thinking, and boy, you know, and I want to drive home the point here, Michael, that I really respect. I mean, physics, there is content, and the students need to learn that content. You know, the argument we're making here is that by drawing on finding ways to draw on the diverse forms of knowledge, even to the point of including that alongside or using that to contextualize that disciplinary content in a diverse range of settings, we think that actually will help students master that very content that you're concerned about.
Yeah, I think I'm listening to this. This is a fantastic conversation. You're right. I mean, I've been trying to map it into my physics classroom and worrying about, you know, clumsily drawing on some examples. And as I think you pointed out, the example of the hair straightener. If I were to try and force sort of these diverse, you know, I'm doing, you know, insulting tokenism and all of those issues. So I'm thinking on it also at another level here, and just you know, if you indulge me for like 15 seconds or so, but I've been thinking of, you know, bringing students in. They're coming out of our grade 11 system into our colleges. And now they're coming into my classroom, and I'm thinking of welcoming students into the culture of science, which is a little bit different than the sort of dominant culture or the culture from which they're coming. And I use just examples, even coming from majority culture. Things like just the language use is different in the sciences. There's a cultural adaptation that has to take place to move towards becoming a scientist, that is sort of a level that maybe I can start thinking about bridging to the diversity within the of the students within the class as that bridge. I'm having trouble getting out of out of the content dominated thing. It says true physics is very I'm teaching stuff 400 years old, done by white males in Europe. It's I'm struggling a little bit with it, but I'm trying to find bridges in my thinking on that. So it's my brain's going about several hundred kilometers an hour.
There's actually a new book that was just published on this topic about power and privilege in STEM learning that is worth looking at. I see that Chao has a hand up.
Yes, I actually want to echo the word Corey has mentioned also in the chat is acknowledgement. I'm a kind of language teacher. I teach Mandarin. I was teaching Mandarin in China and also teaching Mandarin here in Canada. So I constantly feel this kind of like, I guess, cultural awareness, this kind of cultural differences. I guess as a language teacher, and I'm fully aware this kind of like the meaning of any word is not natural for sure. There's always kind of history, there's stories behind the development of just a single word, not mentioned to say like even a concept or even a theory. So I don't know how to. It is a complicated issue, and I still don't have ways to address it. But I guess the best what I can do, at least in my classroom, is to kind of something similar to what Corey just mentioned, acknowledgement. So when we learn the language, for example, like I guess Mandarin, they knowing it's a language produced by this group of people and under a certain of context, and that's why we use this kind of specific kind of words to describe a specific kind of experience. And the words can be evolving all the time. And I guess everyone's kind of current experience is going to make this development, make this involvement. So I'm trying to do that in my class, kind of trying to kind of provoke those kind of conversations, trying to use, I guess, see it's a tool, it has its background, has its history, but also see how I can leverage this tool to make that meaningful for the students, their own kind of personal life, their own kind of experiences here at this particular moment. So I don't know, kind of bring this kind of like smaller talks or smaller discussions, on why this kind of, happening and why this kind of learning. But I know science and social science, they might have different kind of backgrounds and histories. So it just like, I just want to throw out, things there as a kind of food for thought, but I don't have answers yet. And I appreciate everything being shared today. It's kind of really provoking a lot of like my thoughts. So appreciate that.
I just want to highlight that we're approaching 4 o'clock. So if you've been working on this question or comment and it's not perfect, it hasn't been chiseled down to the exact size you want, we encourage you to step forward. And this is a place where we're not looking for perfect questions, but yeah, if someone hasn't had a chance to contribute, please jump in with your thoughts or questions.
Perhaps, Corey, maybe we can take a look again at the guidelines that Dan started with, and maybe do a little reflection on those and how we might refine those to help us structure if I'm just going to jump in and maybe, invite others to jump in as well. So, Dan, if we were to say use sociopolitical controversy to problematize or frame the content, even in the sciences, one of the things that I think I heard today, and reflecting back to something that Selma said, was we could do that by including that kind of, and I think Corey's point about the two-eyed seeing, maybe we do that, those socio-political controversies, we do it in a collaborative way with the learner, and looking at, not looking for the perfect one direction, and maybe trying to take into account what Chris Whitaker talked about, that kind of UDL, but making it rich, making that controversy rich by having multiple perspectives, perhaps, if we were to take just one of these. I think you're on mute, Dan.
Thank you. I do want to make a point about authenticity that comes up quite a bit. One has to be careful. It's sort of authentic in the eyes of who? One of the things that Randy taught me is that many things that are authentic in the eyes of the expert are just impossibly abstract and removed from the experiences of the actual learners. So I think, again, the quest for authenticity is what, created an entire module on chemistry for Black girls and hair. And I think that that's very different than the students in Guida Jabray's paper, that they chose to do that and were supported in that effort. So that's the thing that I'm really struggling with, is we want to be supportive of that and make sure, but I also think that we can still see things like, so for instance, Michael, I wonder, I'm sure that there have been controversies and issues in physics that surface some of the concepts that you're trying to teach that raised socio-political controversies. You'd probably have to dig to find them, but it seems to me in almost every discipline, they're out there. And the challenge is finding them and then presenting them in a way that works towards these larger goals. Much easier in psych, much easier in the social sciences, absolutely. No questions asked. No doubt about it. But it doesn't mean that we can't do it with real things that really happened in real scientific disciplines.
So,
go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say, just because I know sometimes when we hit 4 o'clock, people feel bad about having to go because they have something. So I just wanted to give the space to acknowledge the end of the webinar. We don't have to rush off, but I did want to be able to, while we have people here and they're not slipping out, to officially thank you so much for being with us these 2 webinars and kind of bringing us definitely lots of rich content, concepts and frameworks to think about. And if this were my class, I'd be saying, before you leave this Zoom class, please write one takeaway in the chat, something that you think is going to stick with you as you leave today's seminar. So if you feel you have energy on a Friday afternoon, one way to thank our guests is to take a second to add something that you are going to take away with you from this space today. So while we're doing that though, but again, we don't have to shut it down right away, but thank you everyone for joining us today on this Friday.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Elizabeth, Corey, and Selma for the opportunity. As you can see, I was really used this opportunity to move some stuff forward that I'm really excited about. So thank you again for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
I'm going to say thank you very much for this. I mean, the two seminars have been fantastic. This one, as I say, is presenting some challenges to me, but that's why I'm here, right? To be challenged on this, and it sparked some beginnings of ideas, but it's really sparked the need to think about this more concretely in my practice. So thank you very much.
Awesome. I'll be thinking about you as I'm working on this. I love to have these kinds of experiences because that's always going like, but what would Michael say? How would he respond to this? So super. Well, I actually have a PI meeting that the same one I had after this that I was late for last time because I forgot about it. So I actually can't stick around very long. But boy, I sure hope we can continue this conversation. Really looking forward to maybe symposia or really.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah. So let's. And Elizabeth, you're a co-chair of ICLS 2023, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, so that's exciting.
So definitely, I think this topic is one that's very rich. In fact, I'd like to invite you to Saltese Conference 2022, and maybe we can have that continuation at that conference, in preparation for other work together with this team and other teams of people who are interested in trying to tackle what is a very difficult and challenging and meaningful and important question. How do we design to be not just inclusive, but I think it's more than just being inclusive. I think we're trying to leverage what is that fund of knowledge. Thank you very much, by the way, for explaining fund of knowledge to us more clearly. But I think that would be a wonderful way of thinking about working when people can work together because they truly are leveraging what the other person's perspective brings, the cultural perspective brings.
Yeah, absolutely. I never turned down an opportunity to get north of the border.
Clearly, when we hear about your Friday afternoon schedule, you don't turn down opportunities. Meeting, webinar, meeting.
I just got a ping from my PI wondering if I'm going to show up, so I got to go.
Yeah,
so thank you.
Gotta go. Thank you. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank
you. Thank you,
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah.